I know that how you place in your show is important, but how you improve from one show to the next is the real measure of success in bodybuilding. Placings are hyper dependent upon who else shows up, whereas your raw improvement over time is absolute. And enough improvement stacked up over months and years will improve your placings over time. If you want to place higher consistently, just get yourself better. And frankly, this is where it falls apart for a huge number of competitors. They just don't improve much between shows. The good news is that, of course, this is a fixable problem, so let's dive in on my top tips for how to actually improve between shows. Jumping right into it here. Tip number 1, don't lose your mind after your show. Often enough that it almost becomes expected, the show turns into a show almost as soon as you're off stage. The binge eating starts, and for some people, it doesn't stop for weeks, at which point you might have gained 10, 15, or even 20% of your body weight. Not pounds, but percent. So part of this goes back to your last prep. Make sure that you have enough time during prep that you aren't crashing at a maximum deficit all the way into the show. Start prep early enough that you have time for a deload or a quick break at maintenance for a few days or a week halfway through. If you can make it to the finish line knowing that you've worked hard, but you're still feeling like you have some self-control, that's a great goal. Otherwise, if you gain a ton of weight after your show, you can not only set yourself up for a very uncomfortable off-season, but also start thinking that you just need to hop back into a deficit to clean up your mess. Do not do this. That is a huge mistake, and you'll be completely negating your off-season and setting yourself up for a big downward spiral. The immediate goal post-show is very basic. We want to reverse the negative adaptations your body experiences during prep. This is going to be massive fatigue, sleep and digestive dysfunction, reduced training performance, and more. 2 things help with this: rest and weight gain. But the weight gain should be reasonable and somewhat controlled. Tip number 2, give yourself time. I like to think of a 2-to-1 ratio here. If you took 16 weeks to prep, I'd start by default thinking you need 32 weeks minimum to focus on improvements between shows. Now, of course, this is going to be highly dependent on where you're at in your larger bodybuilding journey, but it's a good starting point and way more time than most people think they need. But hey, if you aren't having your long-held beliefs challenged, you aren't going to grow. Building muscle takes time. And it's tricky because you're not going to be seeing changes week to week, most likely, as you can during prep. It's even more about those 2 magical words of bodybuilding: delayed gratification. Put in the work, stack up wins in the gym, and keep your diet largely in check. Make sure you're fed well enough to grow, and be patient. Tip number 3, be focused and prepared to sacrifice. Here's the truth. If you're serious about bodybuilding, then we can't really call it an off-season because it's just as critical to your progress as prep, if not more so. To make the most out of it, you can't be slamming 2 to 3 cheat meals a week, then go on vacation and eat every meal off plan for 8 days while skipping workouts and cardio, then come back and take 5 days to get to the grocery store and get your normal meals prepped again. I mean, you get the idea, right? It's just a mess. You've got to stay on it. What I tell my clients in most cases is that I don't need them to be perfect in the off season, but I can't have them losing the plot entirely. Meaning we need to remember what our long-term goal is and make sure that the majority of our choices and actions are in line with that. Absolutely. Take a vacation and a week off from the gym, but don't be sloppy when you're at home on both sides of that trip as well. It's going to take some sacrifice, so make sure your close circle, your family, friends, etc. are on board and they understand. But be willing to sacrifice for them also and make concessions against your plan periodically. There's a compromise spot there where everyone can be happy, and during the off season, I think most people find they have to explore that give and take a bit more. Save the hard ass 100% Terminator mode for prep. Now, tip number 4 is realistically the most important part of this process. But before we get to it, I just wanted to plug my podcast real quick, The Drop Set, which is available anywhere you can find podcasts. I talk about all things related to bodybuilding generally in about 40-minute chunks. And there's an archive of over 225 episodes on just about every topic imaginable so far. And yes, if you're enjoying this video so far, please hit the like and subscribe button. Thank you. You know who really thanks you for that? Derby. Isn't she just the sweetest? Yes, she is. Now, what's possibly the most important part of your time between shows? That is tip number 4. Get a needs analysis done. This is getting into the nitty-gritty, the nuts and bolts. What are you actually trying to improve and why? If you're finishing 2nd, 3rd, or 7th in your wellness class, you might automatically think, oh, I need bigger legs. And maybe that's true. Or maybe you had the biggest legs on stage, but your conditioning wasn't there, or your midsection was too blocky, or you have no shoulder caps at all, and everyone else on stage did. If you finished 4th in your classic physique class, you might reflexively say it was because your arms, you have a hard time getting them to grow. But in all cases, you've got to look at the stage photos and break down each body part in each pose into strength and weakness columns. It can be hard to do this yourself, and if you have a coach, they absolutely should be doing this for you. You might have to ask them for it, remind them gently, but get it done. If possible, you also want to see the class comparison photos to see how you stacked up against those who placed better. This can help give you insight into what the judges rewarded that day. Just keep in mind, this isn't always going to be the same at every show. You can then use this needs analysis to set your priorities for programming your training in the off season. If something is a huge strength, stop training it for a bit, except for maybe a couple sets every other week. It likely doesn't need any more volume than that just to retain tissue. Spend your time and the energy in the gym on the things that need more work. Now, very closely related to that, we have the thing that really chaps everyone's hide. Tip number 5, fix your mechanics first. So let's say you do a needs analysis and you find your chest is lacking. Cool, so we'll just train chest 3 times a week, right? Hold up, Turbo. Not so fast. Ask yourself first, is volume really the problem? This is absolutely everyone's first reflexive move, but it's very often the wrong one. For most guys, if they have a weak chest, it's not because they don't train it enough. It's because they don't train it well. Fix your mechanics. Hire a knowledgeable trainer or have your coach evaluate some gym footage and break apart your mechanics and execution on these exercises. Shake up your postural cues, setup, tempo, and improve your proprioception and see how much different your training feels after that. That is likely what most people need in most cases. At least that's where I start. I'm never adding volume to a specific body part for anyone's program until I know how well they train it. Adding more volume on top of mediocre execution will fix absolutely nothing and just slow down recovery and probably not help the muscle group in question improve at all. Understand that more work isn't always the answer. Sometimes it's taking the ego hit that you have skills to improve first and get back to the basics of execution so you can really grow. And finally, tip number 6, get healthy. And no, I'm not talking about doing a juice cleanse or adding a probiotic, but getting your lab work checked. This is especially relevant to the point of being essential for PED users. But natural competitors should do this as well. Prep can do a number on your natural levels of testosterone, estrogen, T3, and more, and that's just on a hormone panel. There's 2 schools of thought here. Realistically, your labs will be at their worst right around show day, probably, either because you're pushing PEDs the hardest right there, or just negative adaptations from prep that all people experience in a cumulative fashion. So you can either check things right then to see the worst case scenario, or wait 4 to 6 weeks to allow for some natural recovery of a lot of those markers and get a clearer idea of what your true baseline is. Now, 4 to 6 weeks is really pushing it as far as being enough time, but it's usually long enough to get an idea of what's fine and what still needs some work, either through modulating volume and rest, working in some over-the-counter supplementation, or some other intervention. Keep in mind also that at this time, more PEDs are not the answer. You should either be off entirely or running a very low-dose TRT protocol, and that is it. And it goes without saying, but yet I really have to turn the screws on nearly every one of my clients at this point. Getting the lab work done is the start, not the end. If you have important items out of range, hematocrit, GGT, C-reactive protein, reverse T3, among others, we need to evaluate all elements of your plan and actually make the necessary adjustment. You can't just say, oh, that's f***ed up, and then keep doing what you're doing. This is how you end up with a shorter bodybuilding career, which none of us want. Okay. So now it's time for you to get to work. If you slack on these items, it's hard to really make much improvement from one show to the next. But if you really commit to every one of these items, you will show up on stage next time easily beating the past version of yourself. And in time, that version of you is going to be moving up in placings regardless of who else is on stage with you. Thanks for watching, everyone. Catch you all next time.